Like many other African countries, the independence movements from colonial rule um, ended in the 1950s, early 60s. So Sudan, I think, got their independence sometime in 1959, and set up a civilian government, like most of their compatriots around the region. Um, but they had a very unusual transition into military rule because the then prime minister, a guy called Khalil, um, had a coup against himself, which is highly unusual. So he transitioned his government in a self coup, which I don't think has been observed anywhere else in the world, into a military government because he needed control. And obviously, Sudan is a vast country with a, a, an unusually high amount of diversity in terms of ethnicity, religious persuasion, um, cultural practices. In fact, one of my friends who is South Sudanese told me that Sudan has over 500 different languages, and for reference, Kenya has about 50. So it's a huge country with a lot of people and a lot of different uh, interests as a result of that ethnic diversity. There was massive protests in Sudan, citizen-led protests where people, the common mwananchi, as we call them in Kenya, was advocating for a transition to democratic rule. So the generals sort of seized this opportunity, they usurped the president, and then they form a transitional council promising that they're going to move the country to democratic rule, with obviously, I guess, pressure and support from regional allies, particularly Kenya was involved, Ethiopia, the UAE, who they heavily depend for armaments.
Who are the RSF rebels?
Well, so the RSF are a paramilitary unit that's supposed to be part of the Sudanese army, and I'll explain in brief why that is. So if we just go back, to where Sudan has come from. If you remember, Sudan until 2010 was what is now Sudan and South Sudan.
Yes.
That was one contiguous country. Like many other African countries, the independence movements from colonial rule ended in the 1950s, early 60s. So Sudan, I think, got their independence sometime in 1959, and set up a civilian government, like most of their compatriots around the region. But they had a very unusual transition into military rule because the then prime minister, a guy called Khalil, had a coup against himself, which is highly unusual. So he transitioned his government in a self coup, which I don't think has been observed anywhere else in the world, into a military government because he needed control. And obviously, Sudan is a vast country with an unusually high amount of diversity in terms of ethnicity, religious persuasion, cultural practices. In fact, one of my friends who is South Sudanese told me that Sudan has over 500 different languages, and for reference, Kenya has about 50. So it's a huge country with a lot of people and a lot of different interests as a result of that ethnic diversity. So between the 1950s and the 1980s, there was a series of coups. So there were about 3 different coups where military generals basically usurped each other. So there was Khalil, there was Nimeri, there was a guy called Dahab, and all took over. 1969, there was a military coup, 1985, 1989. And then finally, you had this guy called Bashir, who is the more familiar name for most of us who have grown up in the 80s and the 90s. So Bashir realizes that he has to manage the military leaders that surround him, because well, being a taking over a country through a coup and then surrounding yourself obviously with equally ambitious generals and soldiers is a very delicate balance, because obviously there's ethnic considerations to consider, there's power dynamics, there's obviously control of regions, control of wealth. So he for many years managed the coup, um, or what he called his revolution. He managed these different military factions by playing into ethnic rivalries. At the time, as I said, Sudan was both Sudan and South Sudan. And one of the things that he did to strengthen one of his military alliances with a group of regional militias at the time called the Janjaweed. And they were notorious for both violence, um, committing extreme acts of violence, and then they were supported by the Sudanese Air Force in quelling rebellion in South Sudan. And South Sudan versus Sudan, South Sudan has primarily Black African communities like the Nuer, the Dinka, and others. There's many others. So he uses the Janjaweed, who are Arab, well, Arab descent Sudanese, and he uses these militias to quell the uprising in the kind of famous place called Darfur, because that's kind of the region of the country they come from. They come from the west. So the Janjaweed were just militias, a group of militias that he was effectively using for ground assaults. They'd come on horseback, commit atrocities, wipe out villages. In fact, estimates say that they wiped out up to 3,000 villages um, um, uh, uh, through this sort of attacks. This war continued from this kind of assault continued from 1989. Then it culminated in 2010 with South Sudan seceding and forming a new nation. In fact, South Sudan is known as the newest country on earth. So what happened was, after all this happened, after the South Sudan breaks away, he's left with these military factions. So he has the army on one side, the Sudanese army on one side, who were supporting the assault on the south. They're the common enemy. They primarily sent heavy artillery as well as the air force, and then you have the ground forces, who are the Janjaweed, who had by this time come together in what he in fact he had formally constituted them as the presidential dogs of war, the rapid support forces. So anytime they needed some really precision attacks on communities in the south, and that is who they used to use. So they were called the rapid support forces. They were under one general, and then on the other side you had the Sudanese army. So this sort of shaky alliance between the Sudanese army, the RSF, and the military dictator Bashir holds for another 10 years. And then obviously, given now that their common enemy was no longer there, the RSF and the Sudanese army combined forces to usurp their president. So Bashir was usurped, and off he went to face the law. Then he was usurped at the time. This is a couple years ago. If you remember, there was massive protests in Sudan, citizen-led protests, where people, the common mwananchi, as we call them in Kenya, was advocating for a transition to democratic rule. So the generals sort of seized this opportunity. They usurp the president, and then they form a transitional council, promising that they're going to move the country to democratic rule, with obviously, I guess, pressure and support from regional allies. Particularly, Kenya was involved, Ethiopia, the UAE, who they heavily depend for armaments, Saudi Arabia, and then the US was also part of that international yeah, consortium of countries trying to force them to the negotiating table. The African Union was also involved. So then this transitional council is formed. It holds for a few months, then it collapses, and it kind of spirals back to what they know best, which is military rule. So obviously there was the head of the head of the army, the Sudanese army, and then the head of the RSF, former Janjaweed, were basically the president and the vice president, and then a power struggle broke out between them. So then a war broke out again, and civilians were caught in that crossfire. So to date, about 150,000 civilians, I think 2.25 million people have been at risk for starvation. More than 200 million people have been displaced from their homes. So Sudan is currently, facing a civil war in the traditional sense as we know it. Now, there's just a lot of rumor, and nobody quite knows where Kenya got so heavily involved in this civil war in South Sudan. So a couple of things to observe, and I'll hand it back to you shortly. So one, I'm not worried about this, this dalliance between Ruto and the head of the RSF, a guy called Hemeti. So first, standing between Kenya and Sudan is their arch nemesis, South Sudan, right? So already we have that buffer, and also to the north we also have Ethiopia. So it will be very hard, other than sort of diplomatic posturing, the kind of letters and public pronouncements that we've seen. It'll be very hard for for Sudan to mount an assault against Kenya. And then secondly, so someone once told me that when you start a war, dig two graves, right? Because nobody has a monopoly of violence. The Kenyan army is one of the best trained armies in the region. So in terms of sort of deterrence and ability to deal with any military campaign against Kenya, I personally think our forces are pretty well matched, considering that this group would be then fighting against the RSF. If they want to get the KDF involved, South Sudan is also, on standby. The Ethiopians to the north. So I don't think a regional conflict would necessarily be something that would happen. I think a lot of what we're seeing is just political posturing. There's a lot of rumors out there as to why Ruto is causing to Hemeti. A lot of rumors about him having some stake in the gold trade in Sudan. I think it has something to do with the elections last week. That's what I think personally, is okay. Going on here.
Okay, now.
Yeah, I can explain, shortly what that is.
Yeah, but quite a number of things to unpack here because there's so much going on. And of course, this is geopolitics that your average Kenyan typically does not follow. So you gave a very good...
We just don't know.
Yes, we don't know. So you gave a very good background, especially of who these RSF rebels are. These ones who have been seen in Nairobi at KICC, and they were what was formerly the Janjaweed. And you give a very good explanation of where the Janjaweed came from. It was a militia that was initially, government sponsored, and they were just meant to rival the other generals to make sure that things are in check, so that Omar al-Bashir could not be overthrown.